Hello and welcome to another Retfurb video. On today's video we look at this faulty Sega Game Gear. It's got a faulty screen and there's no sound coming out of it, so hopefully we can get it working as good as new or even better. So now it's time to get to the video. So let's get started on this Sega Game Gear. First thing to do is take the batteries and just put them in and just give it a go and see what we've got to start with. So straight away you can see there's lines on the screen, no display, nothing on there, so obviously the screen's faulty. Also there's no sound coming out at all. Now we just need to take the batteries back out so we can get to the screws and then disassemble the case. So we have 6 Phillips screws on the back of this and also a security screw at the top. This will need a special tool to get that out. So that's the main 6 screws removed. Now we need a special tool to remove the top screw where the cartridge input is. As you can see, it's very similar to a female Torx type tool. So now the back of the case can be lifted up and then there's 3 plugs that need to be removed for the wiring. So now the 2 halves of the case can now be separated. You've got the battery part and then you've got the main circuit board part. Now it's time to take the screws out for the circuit board, now removing the parts and then we can get the circuit board out of the shell. So I just realised I haven't actually explained why we're taking this apart. So we're taking the circuit board and everything out so we can do an LCD replacement on the Game Gear. This should then repair the faulty screen issue and it should also give a better picture quality for when we're using the Game Gear. We also need to look at the soundboard within the Game Gear because obviously there's some sort of issue that's preventing the sound to come out. Usually it's the capacitors that are gone, so this is the first thing we're going to do, which will hopefully rectify it. That's the board all loose, so now we just need to get it out and then we can start removing some of the components we don't need. This is the LCD screen kit that I purchased. It was purchased from Aliexpress. Now I've purchased one before for another Game Gear that I did, which is actually on another video, but I've never done one like this. This is slightly modified, so hopefully I can get my head around it, but I noticed the manual sort of is a mismatch of both instructions for the other one and this one, so as you'll see when I get further into it, you'll notice that actually, well, I'll explain when I get there anyway, but there's a bit where I started putting the wires on like I did with the other one, which I didn't actually need to do, but once I get to that part I'll explain that. The last one that I bought, which was from AliExpress also, that one was quite a few wires you had to sort of solder in place, whereas this one's got a modified ribbon, which means you don't have to do all the separate wires. But the problem is, because the manual had a bit of both in it, it made it a little bit more confusing when doing it. So back to the task in hand. I'm actually now using the soldering iron to warm up the ribbon so it'll release the solder, so then I can remove the screen with the ribbon. I've just got to be careful whilst doing this that you don't damage the circuit board whilst pulling it off. You just need to warm it up and then the solder will soften and then you can release it and peel it back. Now I'm just cleaning up the solder points on the circuit board. Now I'm going to start removing the fuses either side of the tube light, and then I'm going to remove the tube light. So now the tube light's now removed from the circuit board, we can look at moving on to the next part. And that's both the fuses removed that were at either side of the tube light. So now in the instructions it tells you to remove various amount of resistors. There's a couple of capacitors that have got to be removed, and also a small coil. And then you've got to join up some wiring, which is only minimal. But I'm not going to go through each individual one, I'm just going to carry on and do it, and you'll see me doing it as I'm going along. They're only tiny little resistors, most of them. So all I do when I'm removing these resistors is just heat up each side, and you'll get them to a point where they just come off quite easily. Here I'm just removing one of the capacitors which need to be done. Most of this prep work for the screen is pretty straightforward, to be fair. As long as you follow the instructions carefully, it should be okay. Now, I did mention earlier that this particular kit has got some of the instructions from the previous one on it. Once you've got the modified ribbon kit, it makes it a lot easier so you don't have to do so much wiring. On the back of the board there's a couple of transistors that need to be removed. These are a little bit more trickier because you've got more connections that need to be desoldered. So now the board's all been prepped, it's now time to put the new board in place where the screen used to be. This has points on all four corners which need to be soldered to the original board. So when I was actually soldering this, it was a bit of a pain. For some reason my soldering iron wasn't heating the solder enough, so it kept on going real funny when I was trying to join it. After a while it was okay, and I managed to solder it to the board, and it had a good strong connection between the original board and the new modified board. So that's all the connections now done on each corner of the board, so that's nice and secure. Now we can move on to joining some of the other parts. So I'm just soldering a small wire here just for one of the connections. This one's got to be done regardless of the ribbon. Again, another small wire that needs to be just bridged over on this part. So now we come to fitting the ribbon on the back. This one here, that all lines up. You just need to make sure the pins line up at the bottom where the old ribbon used to be, and then the rest of it should line up okay. On the instructions it gives you all the numbers which should line up on each soldering point. So it was this part on the instructions that I got a little bit confused with. You don't actually need to put any more wires going to these points. Basically what happens is this ribbon goes on the old ribbon area, and then where there's some small holes that line up to the new circuit board, you then solder through that and it connects everything that's needed. whereas I started putting wires through on the connections as well, and then I removed them. I don't actually show all that, but I did it and then I took them off. So it took me a lot longer, and then when I realised it's, it was a lot easier doing it this way. The only thing I would say on this one compared to the last one that I did, the different ribbon connection in the last one, although you had to do a lot more wire connections, the actual ribbon connection itself was so much easier to do, so much easier to join where the old circuit board ribbon connector was. On this one I found it really hard to join the solder with it. It just wouldn't connect properly. I had to keep going over it to sort of flow it onto one to the other. It kept wanting to separate. Whether it's something that I was doing wrong, which it could be. I mean, I'm no professional solderer by any means. But the last one, you just literally flowed over the top and it went on it. But this one just didn't want to do that. So now on this point, I'm just joining the ribbon connector with the new circuit board. You can see I'm just flowing the solder through the hole, which is then joining into the other side, which has got the matching holes. So you can actually check to see whether it's flowing through correctly. If you look on the other side of the board, you'll be able to see the solder coming through. That's when you know that you've had a good connection between the two parts, the ribbon and the actual board. Now I've just quickly connected the LCD screen. We just do a quick test to see whether it's working okay. Now I'd rather do this before I go any further in case I need to sort out any solder joints. So as you can see, the screen's working all okay. Still no sound, but at least we've got the screen. On this metal part which goes inside, it just needs to be trimmed to fit so the new LCD modification can fit in correctly. This is exactly the same on the last one that I did. So here I've removed the small soundboard which is on the back part of the Sega Game Gear. This is just a couple of screws holding it in place, and now we can look at removing the capacitors and replacing for new ones. So the only capacitors I actually had on me were actually a bit large for this, but they did work okay. They're just a little bit larger than what I would have liked, but they all went in there. The case went back together fine, so they were suitable. So now we just fast forwarded to all the capacitors being removed. Now we can start soldering the new ones in place. With these capacitors, because they were slightly bigger, they just need to be put in place and thinking about where you're bending them, just to make sure that they're not going to be in the way when you put the shell on or hitting the outer shell when this one's put in there. So that's all the capacitors replaced on the soundboard. Now we can look at getting that fitted and then getting the rest of the system all fitted up. So I'm just going to quickly connect all this up and just do a sound check before we go even further. So luckily no issues, sound all working good, screen working good, so now let's get the rest of it fitted up. Now there is a bit of modification that needs to be done on the front of the shell to get the screen fitted in correctly. I was trying to take off as little as I could to start with and then realised that the top part actually needed to be cut right away. This won't be able to be fixed with a securing screw like it was previously. So I'm just doing a quick test here now to see if I've got the screen in the right place. You quickly see that it's too low, so then I need to go further with it. So what I've done now is I've turned the screen on, and I'm just using some masking tape to go around the edges of the actual visible screen. So any black areas, I'm just going to put tape over it, so hopefully then I can line it up correctly and it'll make it easier than sort of taking little bits off at a time. So straight away with this part you can see that it needs to go a lot higher, so just removing that top screw point I should be able to get it up high enough. And straight away you can see here that's a lot better. That looks like it's almost in the perfect position. So in the kit they give you this sticky part which goes around the screen. To be honest, it isn't no good. It doesn't really stick the screen to it. So you'll see in a minute that I'll put this on there and then I'm going to use some hot glue to hold the screen in place. A quick clean of the lens before we go any further, because obviously you won't be able to get in there after it's all stuck in place. So now we can remove the protective film on the screen and then get that stuck in place. So now just putting some hot glue around the edges to help it stick better. Now on to fitting the buttons back in and all the other little parts, and then we can get the circuit board back in place and then get it all back together. This is the part that came from the sticky back surround for the LCD screen, so I decided just to put this on the back of the screen because it's got a metal part and I didn't want to risk it sort of touching on any of the circuit board and then shorting it out. Now we can get the circuit board fitted and all screwed down. So the 4 screws that are around the old screen, these won't be used again, so you'll have some left over. So the ribbon cable actually went in quite easily this time. Every other time that I put it in for testing, it didn't seem to want to go in one side properly, but now this time it went in okay. Now we can connect both parts of the shell together. And here I'm just putting in the securing screws to hold the 2 shell parts together. So because there's nowhere for the security screw to screw into, I'm just using a bit of hot glue to hold it in place, just so it doesn't leave an empty hole. And now that it's all screwed back up, we can do another test to make sure it's working okay, and then that'll be it. As you can see, all buttons seem to be working okay, the screen looks good, so we'll just do a little bit more of a test, and then we can just confirm that everything's all okay. So that's another successful refurb done. The screen looks good, the sound's all working fine now. If I do keep this one, then I'll probably do the rest of the capacitors, but I don't know what I'm going to do with it yet. Once again, thanks for taking the time to watch the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.